Today, Ciara and I will be discussing Kimberlé Crenshaw's writing titled Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. Crenshaw discusses various dimensions of intersectionality, including structural intersectionality, which is how the intersection of gender and race leads women of color to experience domestic violence in ways that are quantifiably different than that of white women. She also discusses political intersectionality, which is how feminist and anti-racist politics have helped to marginalize the issues of violence against women of color. Crenshaw also discusses in detail how anti-racist politics within communities of color have undermined and occasionally justified violence towards women of color. She further goes into talk about how feminist efforts have often othered women of color in conversations regarding domestic violence, and how feminist resistance strategies and support services, such as women's shelters, have resulted in a lack of accessibility for non-English speaking women. To provide some background, Crenshaw begins her analysis by recognizing how society has embraced identity politics through politicizing domestic violence and rape by separating these acts from the traditional view that the private life, which includes these acts, are not to be interfered with by the public. However, she points out that despite these changes, mainstream liberal discourse often views identity categories as sources of marginalization and bias. This view proposes that we should aim to remove the social significance of identity categories to reduce this bias. Crenshaw argues that this view fails to recognize differences within groups, though. For example, by failing to recognize differences among women due to their race or differences among people of color due to their gender. Crenshaw calls this a lesion of difference, which results in a failure to address the intersectional discrimination these groups may face on account of multi-group membership. When discussing structural intersectionality, Crenshaw conducted a field study of battered women's shelters located in Los Angeles, which identified how many women of color experience additional discrimination due to the relationship between gender, class status, and race. Many women of color experience greater poverty and childcare responsibilities due to gender and class oppression. Crenshaw notes how this class burden is compounded by the housing and employment discrimination that women of color face, resulting in women of color being less able to depend on family and friends for shelter. This results in greater subordination of women of color who are victims of domestic violence, as they often have less access to supports such as family compared to white women. To illustrate structural intersectionality, Crenshaw uses the example of immigrant women seeking permanent residence in the United States through marriage. Before 1990, permanent residence required immigrant women to remain married for 2 years before applying for permanent resident status, which required both spouses to submit an application. This meant that immigrant women relied on their spouse for permanent resident status, making them vulnerable to staying in violent relationships. After 1990, the Immigration and Nationality Act was amended to allow waivers for women in these circumstances, though. However, Crenshaw points out that these waivers required reports by the police, medical professionals, or other community members, of which immigrant women of color often had less access to. Moreover, immigrant women often rely on their spouse for information regarding their legal status, which allowed violent spouses to leverage false claims of deportation if the woman left the violent situation.
In this section, Crenshaw discusses what the concept of political intersectionality highlights, which is that women of color are placed between two subordinated groups, those of which have conflicting political agendas. She notes that splitting between two groups is a dimension of intersectional disempowerment, which is rarely confronted by men of color or white women. For example, racism is not always experienced by women of color the same way men of color would experience it, as well as how sexism for women of color may not be the same experience as white women. Furthermore, she discusses the failure of anti-racist and feminist discourses to address the intersection of race and gender. She also notes how the analysis of people of color and women often denies the validity of one another. Crenshaw states, quote, Women of color can be erased by the strategic silences of anti-racism and feminism, and quote, resistance strategies of feminism will often replicate and reinforce the subordination of people of color and the failure of anti-racism to interrogate patriarchy means that anti-racism will frequently reproduce the subordination of women. In this section, one method used was the attempt to look at the Los Angeles Police Department statistics on domestic violence interventions by the precinct, which would have provided information for the number of arrests for racial groups. Although Crenshaw was unable to view these statistics, she was first informed by a representative that they were not released because the department feared their efforts would be undermined. In addition, an informant stated that some minority communities did not want them released due to the fear of unfair representation of the violence in their communities, as well as reinforcing stereotypes used to justify oppressive police tactics and discriminatory practices.
Crenshaw identifies how anti-racist politics have often been exclusionary to feminist efforts when she points out how some critics allege that feminism has no place in communities of color. This rhetoric denies that gender violence is a problem in the community and characterizes any effort to politicize gender subordination as itself a community problem. Crenshaw examines Shahrazad Ali's book, The Black Man's Guide to Understanding the Black Woman, to demonstrate an extreme case of this perspective manifesting in the Black community. Crenshaw outlines how Ali blames the deteriorating conditions within the Black community on the insubordination of Black women and on the failure of Black men to control them. Ali goes so far as to advise Black men to physically chastise Black women when they are disrespectful. Ali's view is that patriarchy benefits the Black community by aiding and liberating African Americans and thus must be exercised with coercion if needed. This view, although not representative of all anti-racist politics, is obviously very damaging to women of color who need issues of intersectionality to be addressed at every level of discrimination to obtain true liberation in terms of both racial and gender liberation. Obviously, Ali's extreme views do not represent the entirety of anti-racist politics. Crenshaw also identifies more nuanced ways that anti-racist politics have led to the suppression of domestic violence issues in the name of anti-racist efforts. She brings up Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, which discusses the debate surrounding the political costs that Black communities may face if they reveal domestic violence in their communities. Critics argue that Walker depicts Black men as violent, which will be bolstered by the violent Black male stereotype in society. However, Crenshaw highlights that these criticisms are overly concerned with avoiding the stereotype, rather than actually breaking down the stereotype as an obstacle to revealing and addressing violence towards women. Crenshaw also points out that anti-racism efforts often reduce violence towards women to an issue of just racism. She counters this perspective by acknowledging that if this were the case, women of color would experience violence similarly to men of color. Obviously, women of color do not experience similar violence to men of color, illustrating a tendency for anti-racist politics to overlook gender violence.
In the Race and Domestic Violence Lobby section, she discusses how race-based priorities and feminist concerns suppress minority experiences. Furthermore, how there is the assumption that domestic violence is only a minority issue, or with individuals who are poor. These stereotypes remain in place, however, it occurs in every racial, ethnic, or economic background. Yet these stereotypes do not appear to be removed with the fear that domestic abuse in white homes or upper class will be exposed. By politicizing violence against women, it challenged the belief that it only occurs in the home of others. Two examples Crenshaw focused on in this section were the Violence Against Women Act of 1991 and the show 48 Hours on CBS. First, in terms of the Violence Against Women Act, this was said to be for all women. However, they looked past other women, as Crenshaw described it. By doing so, with the implied other victim, This works as a political appeal to rally white allies. Crenshaw says, quote, "The experience of violence by minority women is ignored, except to the extent it gains white support for domestic violence programs in the community. By not listening to women of color or including them, this then causes the lack of resources available to them as well as the concern. In terms of the 48 Hours program, it demonstrates the way that even in media, the domestic abuse perpetrated against women of color is either ignored or diminished." In this program, the Black woman's portion on the show was heavily graphic and diminished her, compared to the others, all who were white. Quote, "Tokenistic, objectifying, voyeuristic inclusion is at least as disempowering as complete exclusion." Finally, in the Race and Domestic Violence Support Services section, Crenshaw discusses the inability for non-English speaking women experiencing domestic violence to seek support services that are able to accommodate them. In addition, she discusses the exclusion of women of color in terms of their involvement and needs in policies, which should be included, however, they are not. And by doing so, it can cause intersectional subordination with resistant strategies designed to respond to the problem. The two examples in this section were the letter written to Potter as well as the Coalition Act. In terms of the letter written to Potter, it demonstrated that the set of rules in place at shelters overmine the safety of women and removing them from their situation. Furthermore, the requirements these women have to meet continue to marginalize women of color as they have the least accessibility in terms of receiving help from shelters. Therefore, failing this woman and her child by imposing more stress upon her and unfortunately not providing her a safe space. This case demonstrates the need for more shelters which are accessible for those who are of color or are not predominantly English speaking. In the New York State Coalition Act Against Domestic Violence, it failed to include the needs of colored women. Even in the attempts to include them in the organization itself failed, as it was predominantly white women. In this case, when candidates who were favored by the women of color, they were rejected by the white women due to not having recognized feminist credentials, demonstrating the power struggle. Furthermore, when women who are not of color possess more power within these movements than colored women do, this is a critical issue. In addition, Crenshaw notes that the lack of incorporation from women of color is, quote, "sometimes a deadly serious matter of those who will survive and those who will not." These are our discussion questions.